Hi, welcome to 21 Wire Live. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon or this evening. If you're in the UK, we've got a very special broadcast today. We've got a very special guest waiting in the wings, and we'll introduce him in a moment. But before we do, I just wanted to say that we are streaming out live on YouTube, also on Periscope, on Twitter, and on Facebook Live as well at the 21st Century Wire fan page on Facebook. So you can catch us on those live streams. And of course, up at 21stcenturywire.com at the top of the features section, you'll see a live stream post there where you can also watch this program, this broadcast. Now, our next guest, very special guest, and this is falling on a time when we're looking back at the Arab Spring. 10 years, we're approaching the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring as a geopolitical phenomenon. Our next guest is the former British ambassador to Syria and also from Bahrain as well, served in that post from 1999 to 2002. And his name is Peter Ford, and he is joining us on the live link right now. So we'd like to welcome him to 21 Wire Live. Hello, Peter. How are you?
Hello, Patrick. I'm great. I'm very pleased to be with you today.
No, it's great to have you as well, Peter. And before we start, I just wanted to allow people to familiarize themselves with you in your background, how you got into your line of work for your career, the Foreign Service, what sort of drew you into that. And also after that, we're going to talk about the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring and then look at how the foreign policy landscape looks in the Middle East right now after 10 years of intervention by Western powers, by NATO member states, by the Gulf states, and then look at what we could expect going forward in 2021. But before we do that, just give us a little background, Peter, about yourself and how you got into the Foreign Service, this line of work.
Well, I'm a fully paid up member of the British Foreign Office Camel Corps, as it used to be called. I trained as an Arabist soon after joining the Foreign Office. I was a linguist, but I had to learn Arabic from scratch and was sent to Beirut to a special school of Arabic there, known by the locals as the Spy School, not without some reason. And then I pursued a 35-year career in the Foreign Office, about half of it in or dealing with the Middle East. And then I jumped ship to join the UN for a further 8 years, based again in the Middle East, doing refugee work.
Now, as a lot of people might know, this is the 10-year anniversary of the Arab Spring. It's hard to sort of put that into a box neatly now 10 years later, but at the time that was a major phenomenon. It was an event. It was a geopolitical event. A lot of people had a lot of hopes and dreams. That was the mainstream narrative, that this would somehow fix the region, which had been hamstrung by dictators for so many years and so forth. That was the kind of the general mainstream line. Yourself looking back at it, what are your thoughts now after 10 years on from that, say, pivotal moment in geopolitical history?
Well, the effects are still working their way through after 10 years. It reminds me of the very wise former Chinese foreign minister who was asked for his assessment of the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to say. Nevertheless, we can make some observations about the Arab Spring, and I'm afraid they're nearly all negative. As we look back over the achievement of the last 10 years, we have to conclude that the gains for Arab peoples have been virtually nil, while the net beneficiaries have been mainly Western powers.
And in terms of your formerly you served as the UK ambassador to Syria from 2003 to 2006, and before that you were with one of the Gulf states in Bahrain. You're stationed there, and I'd assume, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but 2003, around that time, might have been a sea change in British foreign policy. How did the Foreign Service change? In other words, you as a diplomat, um, you might have come into it with a certain remit, and has that changed since when you got into the service? And was 2003 one of those watershed moments?
Yes, the Iraq War around 2003 was one of those watershed moments. It was, but we really have to go back further to perhaps the days of the fall of the Soviet Union, early 90s. That is when the West developed hubris with regards to the Middle East and the rest of the world. You'll recall those pundits who were claiming that we'd reached the end of history, that the Western model was triumphant. And when the Arab Spring came along, it seemed to many that this was the prophecy coming true with regard to the Arab world, just as it had apparently come true with regard to Eastern Europe. It wasn't called the Arab Spring for nothing, because we'd earlier seen European springs. And so this apparently inevitable march of Western-style democracy across the world occurred on my watch. It happened, began to happen in countries where I had served, and I saw seeds being sown, although the Arab Spring didn't begin until 4 years after I'd left Syria. Now, nevertheless, the seeds were sown in Bahrain in terms of a growing demand for a say in government on the part of the ordinary people of Bahrain, and because Bahrain has for many, many years been run essentially as an autocratic kingdom, ruled by one family, which happens to be of the Sunni persuasion, while the majority of Bahrainis happen to be Shia. And in Syria, of course, I also witnessed, indeed, personally encouraged some green shoots of democracy, with a certain amount of support from the local government. It's worth remembering that back in 2003, Bashar al-Assad, the president, was having tea with Her Majesty the Queen in Buckingham Palace, and was seen as someone who could usher in a certain amount of liberalism and democracy in Syria. But things panned out very differently. If we pan forward to 2011, when it all kicked off, it started well enough in Tunisia, very tragically, of course, triggered by the very public self-immolation of a street trader who was being harassed by the Tunisian police, and that set fire to a lot of dry tinder that was lying around initially in Tunisia, and then, as if by a domino effect, across virtually the whole of North Africa. And before long, the secular government of Tunisia had fallen, and then with some help from Western bombers, Gaddafi, the dictator Gaddafi, was removed from Libya. Mubarak, again given a nudge by the Western powers, was dislodged from power, and the Arab Spring seemed set to sweep eastwards across through Syria and into the Gulf. And indeed, we saw in Bahrain huge demonstrations. But this is where it all ran into the quicksands. And I will expand on that in a moment. But Patrick, maybe you have a question here.
Sure, sure. So, one thing that struck me, after this, obviously we're reporting on things that are breaking from 2010, 11, but afterwards, when I was in the academic setting in Britain, and in looking at how the Guardian and some of these traditionally left-wing newspapers, these sort of intellectual cauldrons, if you will, how they're looking at civil society, and it seemed like there was this real push to promote the emergence of civil society in places like Syria, for instance, but not in places like Bahrain, where someone like Nabil Rajab, as you know, imprisoned many times. There's plenty of opportunities for the media to make that a big issue, and they chose to ignore it, but wanted to really pump a lot of money into NGOs and this kind of government in exile in Syria. In Libya too, they had the same type of National Transition Council and Western appointed cabinets in exile. But there's a clear double standard there with media, academia, and there's this coordination really that we want reform in some places, but we don't actually want reform in other places. What's your experience and your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think we witnessed a massive, though largely unnoticed, drift to the right in our entire body politic, certainly in the UK and probably more widely, so that papers like The Guardian that would previously be anti-war and anti-imperialist became almost overnight, maybe the Iraq War was one of the turning points here, became almost overnight virtually organs of the of state security, and we're perfectly happy to see the use of military force to change regimes, all in the name of alleged humanitarian values. And humanitarianism, the banner of the left, was turned into a pretext to apply the policies and the attitudes and the mindset of the right. And that is what we saw with Syria in particular. But also Libya, where most of the so-called liberal media were quite happy to see Gaddafi taken down, even if it meant the use of Western jets to do so. And they were more than happy to see Western military intervention in Syria. In the case of Bahrain, they were largely indifferent, although the amount of oppression in Bahrain, I can tell you, was much greater than it ever was in Syria. So we saw and continue to see a massive shift in the ideological tectonic plates, so that yesterday's anti-war, anti-imperial liberals are still today self-described liberals, but the whole definition has changed. They are now militantly in favor of Western aggression where it suits a national imperial agenda, but on a humanitarian or human rights pretext.
And another big, you mentioned Libya, obviously the NATO intervention that upended the country, effectively split it into three parts, turned it into a failed state, making it the train wreck that it still is, even to this day. And we talk about Syria, of course, but one of the big set pieces of the Arab Spring was Egypt. at the time, in terms of how the West was obviously the most populated country in the Middle East, one of the most, if not the most populated. But there was such great hope that with the ousting of Mubarak and then the new Muslim Brotherhood, Morsi-led government comes in, and that this would somehow set off a chain reaction around the region. And what happened in Egypt was something quite the opposite, in fact. And really, you could say, has it ended up in exactly the same place where it might have been before all this began?
Very much the same place as before, only a bit worse. The Sisi regime is even more repressive than the Mubarak regime was, and the Western governments have barely murmured against Sisi. They were so happy to see the Islamist government overthrown, and they're very happy, it seems, to see Egypt virtually disappear as a major player in the region and the world. It seems almost centuries ago that Egypt, and with a leader like Nasser or even Sadat, and Saudi Arabia with a leader like King Faisal, they made the weather in the Middle East. Where are their equivalents now? They are pygmies. And this very much suits, of course, the Western agenda. They don't want to have uppity leaders in this pivotal region. They would much rather have leaders who are beholden to the West for their very survival.
And when there's a sort of green shoots of democracy, as you said before, in a place like Egypt, the Western media then gets a hold of this. It becomes a story. It captures the imagination of the liberal intelligentsia in the West, in North America, around the world, really, and that becomes the narrative. It's about freedom and democracy flourishing in a place where there wasn't. And then in a country like Egypt, they really had structural difficulties economically, huge amounts of foreign debt, problems collecting taxes, just perennial problems that a lot of failed states with, a failed central government have, or that a failed economy. And none of that ever could have been improved. In fact, I think they took on more debt with the Morsi government in that 1 year they were in power from the IMF. But still, the commentators, the pundits in the West, they ignore all the economic structural realities, and the focus seems to be exclusively on, this responsibility to protect, or the promotion of democracy, this kind of abstract, postmodern abstract ideal that ignores the fundamentals on the ground. And I don't know if you've noticed the same thing, but I see this as a reoccurring problem that hasn't actually been addressed yet in terms of how the West is commentating or talking about these types of situations in places like the Middle East.
Yeah, there's a willful ignorance of the complexity of these countries, the economic complexity, the social complexity. And when I say social complexity, what I mean essentially is the religious factor, which is basically why the Arab Spring ran out of momentum, because across North Africa, the peoples are fairly homogenous with regard to religion. They're all overwhelmingly Sunni countries. There is relatively little religious friction because the demographics. Whereas in let's call them the Mashrek, the eastern part of the Arab world, religion is absolutely crucial. Syria is a mosaic of communities, and although it's predominantly Sunni, that there are huge numbers, about 40% of the population are not Sunni. So immediately the Arab Spring hits a country like Syria, it's like a tide hitting a breakwater, and that breakwater is secularism and religion, and people simply they just don't understand or want to understand the complexities of Syria. How it would be extremely difficult to have full democracy when people vote purely on the basis of religion, and when they're encouraged by the dominant religion to just be loyal to that community. Applying the Westminster model to a country like Syria is just a recipe, well, to open the gates to the most bigoted, extreme religious fanatics. And any war becomes, as this one did, a war for Sunni supremacy. That is not how it would be seen or described by the Syrian government, by the way, which is correctly keen to stress that its own army, for example, is more than 50% Sunni, and more than half the government are Sunni. Nevertheless, on the other side, on the side of the so-called rebels, the armed groups, they are 99.99% Sunni. They have no doubts about whether this is a war for religion. Whatever men in suits they put in front of cameras or try to pretend that it's otherwise, what you have in Syria is basically a bunch of Islamist warlords fighting a secular government.
And how much of that do you think, in terms of the rebels? I don't want to get too much into the details of what makes up the Syrian opposition, that mosaic, but suffice to say, the armed militant factions, which were very, very heavily supported by Turkey from very early on. I mean, Turkey allowed encampments just over the border, large camps of militants getting ready, preparing incursions from, I would say, as early as the spring of 2011. That effort began to build up. But at the same time, Turkey's changing its face, its shape politically. It's going through a transition that's moving towards a more of a religious dominated government, away from the Mustafa Ataturk Kemalist revolution, towards the you might call it the Sunnification, if you will, of the new Turkey. Do you think that was one of the main motivations of the Erdogan government to give full backing to this destabilization effort in Syria, possibly to transform the face of Syria as well?
Yes, indeed. I think it's been partly as you described it, Patrick, the Sunnification of Turkey and Turkish policy, but also Ottomanization, a return to the past. There are many echoes of the Ottoman Empire reverberating around northern Syria right now, and it appears that Erdogan is trying to channel the days of the Ottoman pashas, when the Turkish writ ran all across North Africa and across the Gulf. Turkey is active in North Africa. It has troops in Libya. It's active in Qatar in the Gulf, and sent a garrison to help protect the Qataris against their Saudi neighbors. I mean, Turkey is one of the big gainers from the Arab Spring. In the last 10 years, Turkey has kind of picked up some of the pieces after the Arab Spring and Western regime-changing efforts created wreckage. Turkey opportunistically stepped in, and what we're seeing in northern Syria is effectively a return to the days of the Ottoman Empire, with the Turkish currency now the currency of choice in much of northern Syria, and it is just so reminiscent of the days of the Ottoman Empire. But of course, it's the other, mainly Western powers, which have also moved in to the wreckage and assumed a more dominant and interfering role. We see this particularly in Syria, of course, where the US even has what I would call occupation forces. I don't see how they can be described otherwise. They're troops numbered in the thousands in northern Syria, without any, by your leave, from the Syrian government. And I would say that the major gainers from the Arab Spring have been the Western powers. When you look back 10 years ago, countries like Libya were grit in the machinery of Western domination. Syria was a piece of grit, but is now threatened and is well on the way to being destabilized. Many of those Arab countries affected by the Arab Spring would not toe the line on the issue of Palestine and Israel, whereas today we are seeing, maybe we can come on to this in more detail, but we're seeing even countries like Morocco ready to establish relations with Israel, and countries like the Emirates and Bahrain have already jumped into bed with Israel. And this is something that the Western powers have been cudgeling the Arab countries to do for many years, and here we are, it's happening. What's not to like if you're one of the Western powers? Whereas the Arab people, as is shown in recent opinion polls, are very far from happy by this turn of events over Palestine.
So that brings us to an important part of the conversation. You know, under the Trump administration, this late effort, the Abraham Accords, a Jared Kushner-led envoy effort to bring the Gulf states kind of into the same fold with Israel, a singular vision of the future of the region, having served in that region, especially in the Gulf states. What are your thoughts on that? The relationship of, let's take Bahrain, for instance. Have they always been sympathetic to Israel quietly? I'm talking about the royal family, obviously, the ruling elite there. Does it make a big difference to them one way or the other? Or is this a real change in strategic thinking by the Gulf states?
Well, the first point I'd make is that in strategic terms, it doesn't matter much anyway. None of the Gulf states ever represented the most minimal strategic threat to Israel. At most, they would give lip service to the Palestinian cause. I used to be a fundraiser for the UN agency trying to raise money for Palestinian refugees, and it was quite an uphill struggle. They didn't even want to pay serious money, conscience money. The leader, I'm talking about the leaderships of the autocratic, often feudal leaderships of the Gulf countries. They were so self-centered, they really didn't care less about these uppity Palestinians who did practice a degree of democracy, and who used that democracy to vote in, an Islamist Hamas government, which of course was anathema to the West and quickly squashed, so that Hamas was left just with the rump of Gaza. No, the Western, the Gulf countries have never had any military role whatever in resistance to Israel, only ever gave lip service to the Palestinian cause. For many years had not even provided much diplomatic support. So their jumping into bed with Israel now is really neither here nor there in strategic terms. It's salutary, perhaps, for the Palestinians to realize that they should stop looking for salvation to the Gulf or to Washington, which have both demonstrated that the Palestinians are on their own. And had this been clear back in the days of the mid-90s, when the Palestinians were selling their birthright in false negotiations, so-called the peace process, when the Palestinians were giving away for virtually nothing their birthright, recognition of Israel, agreement to participate in as quislings in administration of the Palestinian territory, when had they known that a few years down the track they would be abandoned by the West and by the Gulf countries, they would not have made those concessions, and they would have been in a much stronger position today.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. That Palestine, potentially a good candidate, or Israel and Palestine, for a really successful pluralistic democracy in the future, perhaps in the region, but totally ignored, totally glossed over during this decade of Arab Spring and post-Arab Spring. And do you think what Israel has been able to accomplish through the Trump administration in the last few years, the moving of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, the annexation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Jordan Valley, do you think on one hand it's any chances of them achieving any wins, the Palestinian people is slipping away, or is this potentially leading to potentially a bigger conflict in the medium to short term?
Well, I think a historian looking at it would say that this where we are now, the result was nailed on from the day that the Palestinians signed those peace accords in, I think it was 1994. By giving up their position of principle on recognition of Israel, they were giving away their most powerful negotiating card. And then by effectively acquiescing in continuing occupation until the day, which was never going to come, that Israel would agree to withdraw. I think there was an inexorable ability about it that they would end up with virtually nothing. That Israel, the status quo power, would nibble away with acquiescence or even encouragement by people like the Trump administration, and the Palestinians would be left with, at best, a few reservations. In fact, some did predict back in the mid-90s, unfortunately, that this was going to happen. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of those clear-sighted individuals, but any historian would be bound to come to that conclusion today. The Palestinians sold their soul for a packet of promises, and the process is now well on the way to being irreversible.
Now, to switch gears a little bit, back to the U.S. Obviously, we're coming into potentially a new administration in the next couple of weeks in the United States. The Biden administration coming in. There's a lot of talk about changes in foreign policy, what to expect from the new administration. And so I'm going to point to an article that you have penned recently at 21st Century Wire, and the headline is "A Cynical U.S. Policy on Syria Revealed: Block the Russians and the Iranians, Destroy the Economy, and to Hell with the People." Quite a provocative headline, Peter, but actually quite accurate. Now, I'm going to pull a quote from this as well. And this is from the article here. As long as the U.S. puts stymieing its adversaries ahead of any genuine concern for the suffering and the prospects of the Syrian people, including the millions of refugees that condemned by this policy to infinite exile, no end is in sight. And you continue, it's worth bearing in mind that James Jeffrey worked with Obama long before he worked with Trump. Anybody who expects the Biden administration to follow a different path on Syria must be seriously deluded, unless by different is meant an even more reckless, activist, interventionist policy that goes beyond stabilizing. And then the final nail on this one, and there is no Trump there now to apply the brakes. Now, Peter, some people might look at that as a controversial statement. You're effectively separating Donald Trump. I know it's a complicated distinction to make for some people, but was Donald Trump a mitigating force in the region towards U.S. hegemony? I mean, was he really honest and genuine about his initial campaign pledges to withdraw the U.S. from these unwinnable forever wars in the Middle East? A lot of people on the left would say, no, it's all the same. Imperial. Do you think there's a genuine difference in foreign policy overall between the Trump administration and Obama Biden?
I believe that candidate Trump was onto something and knew he was onto something with the population of the states when he promised to withdraw America from the Middle East. And he made serious efforts on at least 2 occasions to withdraw thousands of US forces from northern Syria. And on each occasion, he was thwarted, not just by the government machine, by the deep state, if you like, but also by liberal opinion. This is the irony of it. We touched on this earlier, but centers of opinion that would consider themselves liberal ended up being the champions of US imperialism, demanding that US forces continue to occupy part of a foreign country that has never remotely represented any threat to the United States. And Trump, of whom I was never a great fan, but you have to recognize that he made serious efforts to made serious efforts to withdraw completely U.S. forces, did force a partial withdrawal of some hundreds, and in Iraq also, and Afghanistan, of course, Trump did campaign for and did achieve a certain amount of troop reduction. Now, in other areas, he was reckless. I'm not sure whether with Iran he was on balance a good influence, probably not. But with regards to the Arab world, Iraq and Syria, I think we're going to miss Trump, or at least the locals will.
And so, do you think going forward is that going to be the U.S. role in the Middle East right now? I mean, it's a very different region than it was even in 2016. If you look at how Turkey has progressed, how Iran especially has really shown that it can, assert its interests. Only 12 months ago, it did that in dramatic fashion by hitting 2 U.S. Bases, I believe, with missile strikes, very accurate and firm missile strikes as well. And that caused the U.S., I think, to think twice about its strategic position in the region. But so what is the U.S. left with in Syria, for instance, just to continue to, the Brett McGurk, James Jeffrey spoiler operation to divide the country and keep it economically hamstrung, as you said in your article? Just that spoiler role, is that all that's left, or are they now playing a kind of a supporting role? Is Israel really is an Israeli master plan that the U.S. is assisting now? Who do you think is playing the dominant role?
Well, I think the Israeli plan is what we're seeing with our own eyes. It's in Israel's interest to keep Syria on the boil for the conflict never to be resolved. And since the conflict has been going on now for 10 years, you might say it's a fairly successful policy. Israel is always worried about Syria because it was the one Arab country that would never bend the knee, and which conceivably, by some stretch of the imagination, could possibly represent a military threat to Israel, and that could never be tolerated. So Israel, almost from the start, has just tried to keep the pot boiling, and that is how US policy has ended up. This is what Ambassador Jeffrey, who until very recently was the Trump administration point man on Syria, he said very openly, if we can't win our objective, and we can't at the moment, so hoping for better days, we just want to keep the pot boiling, keep making things difficult for the Assad government, largely through economic warfare, make things difficult for the Russians, keep them penned down in what hopefully will become a quagmire for Russia. And he was very self-congratulatory because in a sense, the policy has been successful. The US has managed to prevent a solution. Whether that is honorable, whether it's actually in US interests, can be discussed. But that is clearly the policy, and that will almost certainly be the policy that the Biden administration will continue to follow. Now, every incoming new government or administration in the Western world feels it incumbent on itself to come up with a new policy for hot button areas. So the Biden administration is bound to come up with some policy labeled as new, but which will look pretty indistinguishable from the Trump era policy. I expect it to carry on with the attempted partition of Syria via those US forces in the northeast, continue with the truly awful economic war, which is creating bread queues, gasoline queues in Syria. Quite how this helps the security of the American people, nobody bothers to ask, but that is the result. It's immiserating the Syrian people, just as the Iraqi sanctions immiserated the Iraqi people and didn't do the least good in terms of dislodging Saddam Hussein. We're seeing the same, it's Groundhog Day with sanctions. US sanctions on Syria are now at least as bad as they ever were on Saddam's Iraq. So I'm very pessimistic about prospects for any change under Biden. Whether the other players will stand still, however, and just let this happen is another question. And here we come perhaps to Russia and Iran.
That's one of the things that struck me personally in recent years. I've been to Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, all of those countries stretching from the Mediterranean right to past the Persian Gulf, touching Central Asia, as Iran does, it straddles Asia. And one of the things that struck me was that we're always talking about these as individual parts, individual countries, individual situations. When we talk about Europe, we're talking about the common market, we're talking about the union, we're talking about these, economic trading regions, but not in the Middle East. And it's permanently balkanized. It's permanently subdivided either by religion, as the West likes to frame it. I personally don't see that as the governing impetus in the region. I think there's also more an economic impetus by those people in strong economic positions to maintain those positions as well. But what would the region look like? You've been in the region. You're very familiar your whole life with the region. What would it look like with a common trading area between Lebanon and Iran, for instance, if that was a common market with freedom of movement and very not much threat in terms of borders being shut because of ISIS activity, things like that, sanctions, things like that. What would it look like?
Well, this has been an Arab dream for many years, sort of Arab common market or an equivalent of the European Union. But it never looks less likely to come about than today. There was a time in the 60s and 70s when serious moves were made to create an Arab common market, but these foundered for many reasons, including economic, but the structure of the economies. These are not, by and large, developed economies. They're competing. Their ability to develop a common market similar to that of Europe, it would be far from straightforward, even if there were no politics involved. But what we're seeing is a fracturing, an ever greater fracturing of the Arabs. At the time, the Arabs, let us remember, did wield great economic power in 1973. This was the high watermark for Arab unity in this century, when it's easy to forget, but I was a young diplomat at the time, and I can vouch for the fact that Western countries were running scared of the Arab oil embargo, and we were, it was us who were bending the knee, who were rushing to find ways to appease the Arabs. How long ago that seems now. There is absolutely no way the Arab world could wield anything like that, that unity of purpose. The ideology has changed. They don't support the Palestinian cause, or even themselves, as they did all those years ago. And this has been, even in a region like the Gulf, which is rich and could be united, their petty rivalries always get in the way. So you get a country like a micro power like Qatar is always going to be a piece of grit in efforts towards Gulf unity. The Gulf does have what used to be a fairly strong common organization, the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, which was built on the model of the European Commission. But this has become toothless as well, having foundered on the rocks of the Saudi-Qatari eternal rivalry.
So we go back to during that time, during the 70s, and Egypt and Nasser, really strong, really projecting a lot of influence, not just political, but cultural. You're talking about Pan-Arabism as a movement, as a regional movement, and that was a very different region. The U.S.'s relationship with Israel wasn't anything as nearly tight and institutionalized as it is politically now in the 21st century. But now we're in 2020. Egypt is no longer there as that potential leader driving, progress or driving politics in the region, driving pan-Arabism. Now the strongest player really is on the fringe of the Middle East in terms of influence, potential economic power, in terms of potential democracy. I know people don't consider Iran as a democratic nation in the West, but actually it is quite pluralistic in many ways and a very active democratic society in terms of discourse, debate, and things like that we're not aware of in the West. Has Iran supplanted Egypt as that beacon for the region? I know it's not an Arab country as such, but in terms of that hierarchy, I mean, what's going to drive things in the future? Turkey is certainly making a play uh, to fill that role, even ahead of Saudi Arabia as a spiritual leader in the region. What are your thoughts on this?
Um, well, Iran, I'm sorry, but we keep coming back to the issue of religion, whether we like it or not. Iran wields a great deal of influence in the region, but it can never get over the fact that it's a predominantly Shia country. Therefore, its alliances are almost exclusively with countries like Syria, which have important Shia minorities or minorities of sects like Alawites, which are closer to Shiism than Sunnism. Um, or Iran can wield influence in a country like Bahrain, where the population are Shia and the rulers are Sunni. Or Iran can have influence in Iraq, a country which has, I think, a majority Shia population, and to some extent Yemen also. But Iran, it's almost unthinkable that Iran could have great influence in other predominantly Sunni countries, purely on the basis of religion. Egypt we used to wield great influence because of ideology, and that ideology was socialism tinged with Arab nationalism. Now both those forces have weakened immensely. Syria is a holdout, but a very weakened holdout of that ideology. And now it's basically a free-for-all. There are no ideologies anymore among the Arabs. Arab nationalism has withered on the vine. Support for Palestine has been part, or the weakening of support for Palestine has gone the same way. Socialism has gone the same way. Communism has gone the same way. All that's left are pockets of Islamism to fill the vacuum. And even Islamism, it appears to be mostly on the wane.
And some breaking news, actually. This just came on our feed here. I just grabbed this. Yemen airport bombing attack occurred as a new government, backed by, I believe, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, arrives by plane in Aden in southern Yemen. And that this is a situation. Obviously, you're familiar. Britain has an incredible history, right back from the imperial days with the country of Yemen. But this is something that is never framed very clearly or correctly in the Western media. That essentially you're looking at a partition forming in this country, really, a northern and a southern Yemen. This is completely obfuscated right now. Even how this came out on the wires, we had to edit it slightly to show that this isn't the government of Yemen, although they're talking about it like this. Is this situation going to accelerate the splitting, the partitioning of Yemen under this new U.S. administration? Because it's been it's got a lot of bad press. This effort, U.S. and British-backed Saudi effort, really in Yemen, which started in the March of 2015, is when the first bombing runs happened. How is this situation? It's a very important geostrategic location, Gulf of Aden, Horn of Africa. If you look at what's happening in the Sahel region, that could potentially come unglued in the next couple of years. A country like Sudan and Djibouti, and these are all really key. The busiest shipping thoroughfare in the world, actually, running into the Red Sea. How are you looking at this situation, from a broader perspective?
Well, Britain and I think the US never saw an Arab country they didn't think would be better off divided and partitioned. And in fact, that's what the British did to Yemen. They divided North Yemen from South Yemen. And to some extent, the current situation is just a heritage situation after that earlier division. We see Libya with the dictator Gaddafi removed, that piece of grit, the country literally falling to pieces. Western powers quite comfortable with that situation. Syria, with the US very proactively working to partition Syria to keep that northern sliver of territory where most of the oil is, most of the grain is. They want that to be kept separate from the rest of Syria. So the Western powers can live very comfortably, more than comfortably, with partition, which weakens Arab unity, weakens those countries, so that they can never challenge Western or Israeli interests. Yemen is very complex. I mean, I don't think I've got long enough to go into the full, to do justice to the Yemeni situation. But I would just like to draw attention to what happened, well, now about 18 months ago, when attacks were launched by drone, probably from Yemeni territory at Saudi targets. For me, this was a real turning point in the history of the Middle East. This was the moment when American domination was challenged, and challenged successfully. When it seems an eon ago now, but the tanker war of 2019, when the US tried to bottle up Iranian oil tankers in the Gulf and prevent Iran exporting any at all of its oil. And Iran showed its claws, partly by launching attacks by drone from Yemeni territory, which took out Abqaiq, the major Saudi oil producing center. This was Iran showing that the whole strategic equation, the whole of modern warfare in the Middle East had to be looked at again, that the US was not as dominant as it had assumed.
And we just got a couple of minutes left before we finish. And I just want to get your final thoughts on what do you think in the next couple of years for the first years of the new U.S. administration? Do you think there's a lot of people are worried right now that this nation building project, specifically in Syria, it's not the only one, but specifically in Syria, that somehow this is considered unfinished business by the Obama administration, had plowed so much money and so much intelligence and effort into building proxy armies, like you said, dividing Syria into components that are they're not able to come together politically or economically, weakening it. Do you think there is a chance of the rebuilding an opposition or a reemergence of ISIS? Is this, or have the facts on the ground just changed so dramatically since Russia came in to the conflict and have really formalized their position in there and re-strengthened and ballasted Damascus, as it were? Despite everything that's going on in the periphery, that things have changed so much. Do you still think there's a lot of people are worried that there's a chance that that might reignite, or they might try that effort again, a revamped opposition proxy war again? What are your final thoughts on this, Peter?
Well, it's funny in a way. We've got through nearly 45 minutes without mentioning ISIS, which has been a huge force of evil for several years, and which has by no means gone away in Syria. Just now, breaking news, fresh Russian attacks on ISIS positions in north-central Syria. And here we are, the West. We don't care a fig about ISIS coming back strongly in Syria, as long as it weakens the Assad government and is a nuisance to Russia and Iran. And yet, only a couple of years ago, it seemed that we'd stop the world to do anything to prevent this alleged existential threat, which was ISIS. I'm afraid we're going to hear more about an ISIS comeback in 2021, largely because we, the West, are preventing the Syrian army from tackling ISIS. The Syrian army are penned down with other operations in northern Syria and trying to get back control over Syrian territory from Turkey and from the US. They're being spread too thinly to cope very effectively with a resurgent ISIS.
Well, that's a major segue, obviously, and I tend to agree with you. Just as they thought Al Qaeda had been in the rearview mirror, that made a big comeback. I don't think ISIS is disappearing from the scene by any means. So it's definitely, there's going to be a lot to look at in the next year or two. But Peter Ford, we want to thank you for joining us for this edition of 21 Wire Live, and we really appreciate your great efforts as well, your writings as well. We've published some of them at 21stcenturywire.com, and we always really look forward to your insights and your particular view and unique take on what's going on in this important part of the region. There's a lot of other topics I'd like to talk to you about, maybe for the future. One of them, of course, is the lockdown issue in the UK. That's a different conversation I would like to have with you, and I'm sure you wouldn't mind weighing in on that as well. But again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for giving me a platform which is largely denied to me by the mainstream. No surprise there.
Oh, actually, I do have this. Let me show you an image I'm going to throw up on screen, and I think some people might get a kick out of here. This is you with Tucker Carlson in April of 2018, I believe. And this has been pulled down from YouTube so many times, this particular segment here. And I think at the time you referred to that, Peter, as your drive-by bombing run in U.S. media. But that was a great segment, by the way, and it was very hot when you went on the air for that segment. But I think you made a big impact as well in the conversation.
Well, at least Tucker was listening, unlike the BBC.
Yeah. So hopefully we won't have to do that again. But in the event that we do, it's good to know that there are some good mainstream journalists that are open-minded enough to hear what people like you have to say on these issues. But take care, Peter. All the best, and we'll hopefully be in touch.
Thank you very much. Bye, Patrick.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for this edition. This is episode 2 of 21 Wire Live. You can also follow us on Sunday. We've got a live radio broadcast, the Sunday Wire. I know some of you who are watching this are already listeners of the Sunday Wire, and we do appreciate your listenership. This is a new format. This is a new show. We'll aim to go out live every Wednesday around the same time. It's usually going to be GMT, late afternoon, and very similar to the time frame for the Sunday Wire radio show, which goes out live on alternatecurrentradio.com every Sunday. So we look forward to listening there and seeing what you have to say in the chat box. We've got some new features that we've implemented on our website, also in the Sunday Wire, and that's because of you, our listeners, who've come in to support us during our winter fundraising drive. We've been able to launch projects like this and other sort of technical improvements and things for our community at 21stcenturywire.com. So we really appreciate your support. And if you want to support us and help what we're doing, please go to 21stcenturywire.com and you'll see links for donations or support us during this important winter fundraising drive. But that's it for this week's edition, episode 2 of 21 Wire Live. Again, I really appreciate you guys joining us. We'll be doing the same live stream this time next week. And we have a very special guest lined up again next Wednesday as well. So we're really looking forward to that. And we hope that you are too. So until then, take care, and we'll see you on the other side. All the best.